Hello, my name is Graeme O'Connor, and I'm the research lead for Dietetics at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And today's presentation is going to look at blood sugar control during illness, particularly focusing on fasting and looking at some nutritional management for children with spinal muscular atrophy. I've recently published some research on feeding in children with SMA, particularly looking at amino acid formulas and the controlling of constipation. So there's a webinar on this as well. So I got a connection through SMA UK through that research. And then I'm happy today to do some more presenting on this area, because I often get phone calls from families with this exact issue, that a child is really unwell and they're not able to eat because of vomiting or diarrhea. And they have concerns about the blood glucose level, just their hydration level. So it's really good to pull this together and hopefully get some good information for families to use in those instances. So the overview of the presentation is the focus will be on illness and the impact on blood sugar levels, and when and why this may potentially cause difficulties for children who have SMA. So we can look at the definition of what a low blood sugar is, symptoms to look out for in hypos or low blood sugars, research specific to children who have SMA, and how to manage nutrition during sickness and illness. And then we can look at the emergency nutrition advice to treat a low blood sugar if that situation arises. So here's an introduction. So glucose is a form of sugar. When we eat, glucose is released into the bloodstream to provide cells with the energy they need. Now, the human body prefers to use glucose or sugar as its first means of nutritional source. We also have proteins and fats in the body, but the body's preference is glucose. So when the levels of glucose in someone's bloodstream is really important for health problems can occur if the blood sugar levels is too low. So we call this a hypoglycemia or a hypo. Or if the blood glucose level is too high, we call this a hyperglycemia. So high blood sugars. But I'll try to make this as simple as possible throughout the presentation so it makes sense. So looking at some definitions here. So a clinical hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar, is defined as a blood sugar low enough to cause symptoms and or signs of impaired brain function. As I mentioned before, the body prefers to use glucose, but the brain only uses glucose. So your body has actual methods in the body to actually to change other forms of, say, fats or proteins into glucose, so the brain can use that. Hyperglycemia may be difficult to recognize because the signs and symptoms are non-specific and they're different for everybody. We've got some key symptoms to look out for, but they are very variable. And of course, young children and children may find it very difficult to recognize what these symptoms are, or even to communicate that they're feeling unwell. So causes of low blood sugar levels specific to SMA. So poor tolerance for fasting. So we look for this around about 6 hours, but again, it does vary from child to child. So fasting has been observed in children with SMA, and they can develop severe hyperglycemia and ketoacidosis. Now, ketoacidosis is a process where if we aren't able to break down any more glucose to use up as energy, our body switches to fat metabolism. And then from that fat metabolism, we produce something called ketones, because that means our body can use that as an energy source. But ketones can cause problems within the bodies, and it can cause the acidic level to change. So that's why we might allude, when you hear about hyperglycemia, the low blood sugar, you often hear about ketones often creep in as well. So looking at the physiology of children with SMA, we know that primarily SMA is causes motor neuron disease, but we also know that children with SMA metabolize, or the way that they break down carbohydrates and sugars is slightly different to children that don't have SMA. And this is due to their muscle mass, and even down to how their body actually stores glucose in the liver. So this is really important when we're looking at glucose control, because it is different to other children that don't have SMA, and we need to keep this bear this in mind. There's been some really good work that's been carried out on this with my colleague Melissa Bellman up north. Medications as well. So these disease-modifying medications that children with SMA now are on can cause problems with the glucose metabolism, particularly nusinersen. So this can actually increase the rate that children actually use up their glucose. So it means we're getting through that stores of glucose more quickly. And depending when you've had that nusinersen injection or the injection, then it will depend on how quickly you're metabolizing that glucose and that sugar. And then, of course, if the child's ill, so we've got reduced nutritional intake, we've got excess output, if they're vomiting or have diarrhea, then this is going to reduce the amount of sugar that's available within the body to metabolize. And if your child actually increases their normal activity level, sometimes when they're cousins or coming over, then they play a lot more. And this can actually change the way that we metabolize the glucose. And particularly in children with SMA, these small changes can really cause a difference within their blood sugar levels. So these are all the causes that we need to be a little bit careful of why our blood sugars might drop low. But children with SMA are a little bit higher risk because of the way that they physiologically metabolize and store sugar within the body. So here are some of the symptoms to keep an eye out for a low blood sugar. So these will vary between each child, but keep an eye out for shakiness and dizziness, sweating and pale skin. Now, of course, children with SMA, they do sweat more than other children without SMA. So this is anything that's above normal for your child. Look out for headaches and irritability. So if they can voice that, that's fantastic. Any sudden moodiness or behavior change, and this again is different to what is normal for your child. And clumsy or jerky movements, trouble paying attention or having confusion. And if they've got any tingling feelings in their hands and even around their mouth. And then if the hypoglycemia is not picked up, it can lead to seizures. So this is why it's quite important that we identify it and keep a track of it as much as we can. Now, if you're not eating or you've got a high output because of the vomiting or the diarrhea, then we can get dehydrated very quickly. And here are some of the symptoms to look out for here. So dry mouth, sleepiness or tiredness, decreased urine output. So there's no wet nappies for 3 to 4 hours in young children or infants. If they're crying, but there's no tears, got the dry skin, headaches and dizziness again with the lightheadedness, and then constipation if it's going on for a long period of time, that reduced fluid intake. So it's really important, if you can, to maintain an accurate record, documenting the frequency and volume of any vomiting or diarrhea. And then the surrounding events around this, and how much they were eating at that time, because your health professional will want to know this information. So if you've got it at hand, it just helps you to keep a track and a log of what's happening. So this is some interesting research that was specific to children who have SMA and looking at fasting. So the study was looking at 45 patients that were in a number of different situations where they were fasting because they were very unwell, or because they were fasting because they were going to have a procedure. Now, of the 17 children actually developed hypoglycemia, which we defined earlier on. That's when the level drops so low that it does cause some problems within the body. They get these symptoms with dizziness and headaches. So 5 of these 17 children who were fasting for acute illness, and 12 of the 17 children were fasting because they had a planned procedure. Now, the definition of fasting here was between 6 and 12 hours. And within this short period of time that the hypoglycemia or low blood sugars were identified. So of the 5 patients with hypoglycemia who were fasting for acute illness, 4 had associated clinical signs with increased sweating and tachycardia. And again, sweating is difficult because children with SMA already have this. And the tachycardia is just increased heart rate, which again, it's difficult to pick up at home. But these children were in a clinical environment, so they were able to be monitored. And then one child also had this lethargy, which is that tiredness, which we mentioned before. So just to clarify this about fasting, because you're probably thinking, well, my child fasts overnight, for up to 12 hours with no problems at all. And this is because when we're sleeping, we actually metabolize glucose, the sugars, very differently. When we're at rest, we actually switch to fat metabolism a little bit more than the sugar metabolism. So if a child is well and they're sleeping, the body can normally accommodate that glucose and the sugar throughout the night. The problem here is if the child is really unwell and they've got an infection potentially, then we know that we change our metabolism. It's something called cachexia, and we actually break down our own body tissues to try to fuel the body so we can fight the infection. But during normal instances, a fasting overnight in a child who's well, our body can metabolize that glucose because of the switch in energy. So just to clarify that. But what's important here is just showing you that children with SMA, they do show signs of low blood sugars much more quickly than a child without SMA. And that's going back to those physiological changes in children with SMA we mentioned before. So be prepared, communicate with your local team. So ideally, you want to have a plan in place if your child becomes ill before they actually come ill. So there's a plan in place. Now, you're very aware probably that the NHS is very stretched at the moment. So you might not be able to get hold of of your health providers you normally would have done, because there's so many vacancies within the NHS at the moment. So make sure you've got a really good plan in place in case your child gets out or gets unwell. So looking at some nutritional management during sickness and illness, and this is relatable to non-sitters, children that are able to sit, and also walkers. So the time of fasting should start from the last time of any significant volume of feed or fluid is taken, of food, sorry. So it's going to vary depending on also how you define significant volume. So just keeping this log is really helpful for the health professional to get involved if this does persist in terms of this illness. Now, ideally, you want to give little and often. Now, we've all been unwell, and when we're really sick, we don't want to eat, we don't want to drink. So we have to take this into consideration. It's easy for me to say this is what we need to do, but of course, if the child's got vomiting and diarrhea, the last thing they want is actually water or fluid. So it's important to keep this in mind. But if you can have food available for the child to graze throughout the day, but monitoring what they're actually having. So if you've got a plate, make sure it's not, crisps haven't gone onto the sofa, they've actually not eaten it. So it's trying to keep that close monitoring. We want to really push these carbohydrate-based foods, because these carbohydrate foods help to control the sugar levels within the body. And you've got these type of foods here that are easy to eat. So you've got the Wotsits, the Skips, what we call maize-based crisps, the Pom Bears, that are really easy to eat and break down. And they've got lots of carbohydrate in them. Breadsticks as well, as anything they can hang on to and just eat and graze on. Fruit smoothies and fruit purees are also fantastic for glucose and sugar for children, and the children's yogurt. So make sure you're getting the full sugar ones and not the sugar-free ones. Fruit juice is fantastic, and any of the oral rehydration solutions, that's including Diorolite. You can also offer children's favourite foods. Of course, these wouldn't be what you want to give all of the time, but when they're unwell, just offer the crisp, the bread, the chips, biscuits, fizzy pop. Try to avoid the cola-based fizzy pops, just because they got the caffeine in them, and that might just cause more problems if the child's trying to sleep because they're tired. So having the orange fizzy pop or the lemonade based pop is better for the child. And remember, this is just time limited, because it's just while they're unwell. Now, before the child goes to bed, you can also give them a warm sugary drink to have just maybe 20 minutes before they go to bed. Make sure it settles okay before they go to bed. And then just a caveat here: if your child isn't used to having fruit juice, then this can make the diarrhea or the vomiting a little bit worse, because the type of what we call the osmolarity of fruit juice is quite high. So just be mindful of how much you might want to give your child. If they drink fruit juice and fruit smoothies all the time, then this is absolutely fine. It's just what their body's used to normally. So just as I mentioned before, we want to get as much nutrition into the child during this time of this illness. So it's, if you've got all these foods that you wouldn't normally offer your child, which are the foods that they enjoy, it is just time limited. And once the virus settles down, you can resume to your normal family foods and the boundaries that you have within that for that child. Looking at medication alterations as well. If they do have loose stools, people don't always think to actually stop their medication for constipation. So if they're on Movicol or any laxatives, just stop those for 24 hours, 48 hours until the diarrhea settles down again, and you can gradually reintroduce that medication. If your child still refuses to eat and drink or unable to keep food down, and they're showing signs of the hypoglycaemia, looking at those symptoms before, it's really important you seek medical support from the healthcare provider. Ideally, you would have contacted your health provider, left a message on their voicemail if you're not able to speak to anyone. Just say, look, my child was really unwell, just to let you know, this is the date and time it's happened, and I'm just a little bit concerned they're not eating. And you can keep them with regular updates every 24 hours to let them know what's happening. Serious hypos can develop quickly in children with SMA, going back to the reasons we mentioned before about the glucose metabolism, storage issues with these children. So by seeking advice as early as you can is really important. Now, I know from families' experience, if they contact the 111 for NHS advice, because they have concerns about children with the SMA, they will say to you to go to A&E straight away. So this is why sometimes it's better to try to get hold of your healthcare provider who knows your child, because they can give you a bit more realistic information. But of course, use the emergency numbers if you need to. But I know from families' experiences, they often just say, go to A&E, because they just have that concern for these children, because they are very complex. So children who are tube fed, if your child has persistent vomiting or diarrhea that's lasting up to 24 hours, it's useful to impose a gut rest. And we do this in the hospital regularly as well. So the general advice is just to stop the feed and allow the child to rest for 6 hours. They might not have any fluid or anything at that time, so you're getting some real gut rest. So you want to sit your child in a chair in case they are still vomiting, so you're keeping their head elevated. And start feeding again slowly at around 50% of the usual feed. So once they've had that gut rest, you can gradually introduce a slow rate, normally about 50%. So if you're normally feeding at 50 mils an hour, then go down to 20, 25 mils an hour. And if you have a feed bolus normally of 200 mils, then cut it down to 100 or 75 mils just to see how the child tolerates it. If you do gravity bolus, then it's difficult to control that rate. But if you have a feed pump where you give a bolus, then just to reduce the rate on that feed pump as well, just by half. So if you're normally doing 200 mils an hour as a bolus feed, and cut that down to 100 mils an hour. And then just to see how your child tolerates it, and then just to titrate that or just modify it as much as you can. If your child does not tolerate that reduced feed rate, then you might want to just give diaurolite or any of the oral rehydration solutions for up to 12 hours. And that this, you can replace, so this diaurolite or the oral rehydration solution would just mimic your normal daily feed plan, or you might want to cut it down by half again, just so you could optimize that absorption. So it's going to match the same, not usual feeding plan, but you just match it with the diaurolite. You're getting those fluids in there as much as you can. If tolerance is poor, reduce the total volume of diaurolite by half, or continue to reduce until the volume is tolerated. So you might find there's that happy medium where they can manage it, but just keep a log of what they are managing, because if the volume is so low that we're just going to get them dehydrated, it's important that we can get an idea that they've had, 500 mils or 1,000 mils. Sorry about that. Okay, just going to move on here. So children who are fed, to continue with this, so hopefully by day 2 they would have started tolerating the diaurolite and you've matched what they would normally be having. And it's at this time which we would do in the hospital as well, that we mix the diaurolite with their normal feed that they would have. So if, say, for example, they have Pediasure at home, we would just mix that within the diaurolite. So their total Pediasure volume is 1,200 mils a day. We would mix 600 mils of the diaurolite, which is normally about 3 sachets per 200 mils. And we will give 600 mils of the formula. So we mix it all together, and that just helps it diluted. But again, all those are really important electrolytes for the body to try to get what the body's losing during these times of illness. So you might want to reduce the feed rate again in the bolus by half, just to gauge how the child is going to manage this titration. Then hopefully by day 3, you've noticed that the child is tolerating this mixture of feed, and you can just gradually increase to 75%. And again, you'll be talking with your healthcare professional. This is often the advice that I will be giving over the phone to families, to say, this is what we'll be doing. So I can keep an idea how many days they've not really been managing to get a decent amount of volume into them. But hopefully just by reducing this concentration, you can optimize that fluid absorption and feed absorption, and get some glucose into them and keep the glucose under control, the blood sugar levels under control. And hopefully by day 4, you'll be able to normalize that feeding plan. But again, hopefully you'll be talking to a healthcare professional, and it might take longer than this, a little bit longer. As long as we've got an idea of how much volume is getting in, we can probably just get away. Because our concern is if you restrict the fluid intake too much, you can cause problems with the kidneys as well. So it's really important that we get a good idea of what fluid is going in. So this is some emergency nutritional advice, just in case the blood sugars do drop quite quickly. You start to see some of these symptoms that are concerning. The child is shaking, they seem visibly confused. and you really want to try to get some glucose into them as quick as possible whilst you're contacting in the emergency team or trying to get the child to accident and emergency to get the intravenous glucose that they may be needing. To treat a low blood sugar in children, normally 15 to 25 grams of sugar is enough to get the glucose level back up. And that equates to about 100 mils of fruit juice. And again, these children could be really unwell. So even though they're having low blood sugars, they're still refusing. It's so important you get them to hospital as quick as possible, because as we mentioned before, if the blood sugars drop too low, we can get seizures, or we can get the ketones, which is when the fats are breaking down, which can cause ketoacidosis, which can make the child feel very unwell. So if you can't get this very small amount of glucose into the child, get them to accident and emergency as quick as possible. Another alternative here is 150 mils of a sugary low-fat milkshake. So going for skimmed milk as opposed to full fat milk, and that's just because the fat can slow down the absorption of the sugar. And make sure you've not got any of the sweetness in these. So often these are really healthy because you want to go for to control the weight gain, but of course the sweetness aren't going to correct that low blood sugar level. And if the child will eat sweets, you've got fortified jelly babies, which is a great source, really quick acting glucose and sugar that can go into the body. But do avoid chocolate, because chocolate is high in glucose, which is good, but it's also high in fat. And the fat delays the gastric emptying, so the glucose can't get released more quick enough to try to correct those low blood sugar levels. So you want to monitor your child's symptoms closely after fluids have been taken. If they do drink the fluids, that's fantastic, but you want to be still thinking about going to accident and emergency. And if there's no improvement after that initial 100 mils of orange juice within 15 to 20 minutes, and you want to repeat it again, and you really are looking to seek medical support at this time. Now, moving on to dialyte shortages, you probably, if you do use dialyte regularly, you might have had difficulty getting hold of it. But just to be aware, you can use any of these brands of oral rehydration solution. They're all pretty much the same. They've got the glucose in, the potassium and the sodium, which just help to rehydrate the children really efficiently. But just to be aware, they are any of these will do. Make sure that they are child specific, and don't worry about just having dialyte. Any of these will be absolutely fine. In case there's even a shortage in these, there's a hospital in London called St Mark's, which specialises in intestinal failure, and they actually have their own solution, which we actually used in the hospital recently because there was such a shortage. And you can make up your own solution at home, and this is making up to 1 litre. So you always add the powder first. If you've got a measuring jug at home, just add the powder first. So you'll need 20 grams of glucose powder or table sugar, and this is equivalent to 5 mils of your teaspoons, so that's level teaspoons. 3.5 grams of table salt, which is equivalent to about 1 level 5 mil teaspoonful. And then if you do have sodium bicarbonate, then you won't, often within the tubs of the sodium bicarbonate, they have their own scoop, which you can use one of the purple scoops within the tubs. Or if you don't have, some of the times I don't have the scoops in there, then you can just use again, half a heaped spoon of your teaspoons. And then you can add cold boiled water up to 1,000 mils. So powder first, and then you add up to 1,000 mils, and then you've got your own solution there. And this is exactly the same as what's in dialytes, and you can use this regularly. Now, of course, when you're adding in all of this sodium bicarbonate, it does make it taste a little bit unpleasant, the same as dialyte, but they put a lot of sweetness and the flavors in there to make it a bit more palatable. So these are some of the some tips here just to help to reduce the saltiness of the feed of the oral hydration solution. So you can chill the solution in the fridge before you drink it. That makes it a bit easier. You can even freeze it for a bit to make it into a slush, and then by adding small amounts of squash or fruit juice cordial just to help with that taste. And then you can also change the sodium bicarbonate to sodium citrate, which you can also get from these a lot of the health stores in the UK, and it's the same sort of same size there, scoops, 1 purple scoop. So just to summarize, have a plan in place with your health provider before your child gets ill. As I mentioned, unfortunately, we do have a number of vacancies within the NHS at the moment, so you might not always be able to get hold of your health provider as you used to. If your child does become ill, keep your local team informed. Even if you're just leaving a message on the voicemail, they often will pick this up at the end of the day if they're out on seeing other families, and they're just aware that your child's unwell, and just keep calling back. But if you're unable to get hold of your health provider, then you've always got your accident and emergency. Call your 111 if you need to, but just from the experience of families, that you might not get the information that you really need there. So keep an accurate food and symptom diary. So if you can hand this over to the accident and emergency teams, or if your local provider gets back to you. Monitor for those symptoms of low sugar and dehydration, but be aware that your child may not be able to communicate that they're feeling unwell. So it's these really subtle changes that are specific to your child that you'll notice, particularly with the sweating. Increase in sweating is a really key marker for this hypoglycemia, that shakiness. Offering favorite foods, so give them, so when they're not having a hypo, give them the chocolates, the crisps, the sweets, just to get some energy into them. It's really important. It is time limited. You will go back to your normal boundaries for these children once that virus passes. If the vomiting and diarrhea isn't settling down, then you want to give some gut rest just to help with the vomiting and the diarrhea, and then give them the diarrhea like for 12 to 24 hours. And then hopefully you'll be able to progress onto manipulation of the tube feed by getting a dilution about 50-50. So you've got your mixer of your standard home formula with your oral rehydration solution, and hopefully you'll just get past the next couple of days. But don't be scared to go to the accident emergency if you're concerned that the child's not been eating for 24 to 48 hours, because children with SMA metabolize their glucose and sugar differently, so they are at higher risk. So just flag this up to the accident emergency teams. They might not always be aware of this. So any questions for you to get back to me through SMA UK. But thank you so much for listening.